You know that feeling when a specific calendar invite pops up in your inbox? Usually just says something mundane like annual sync or year-end review, but your stomach just instantly does a little drop.
Oh, yeah. The heart rate absolutely spikes.
But it's like being called to the principal's office, even when you logically know you've done a great job all year.
It is a very visceral biological reaction, honestly, to being evaluated. Like, we as humans crave certainty, and that calendar invite represents a massive looming unknown.
Exactly. And the reason we get so anxious is because we know the stakes. I mean,
Mhm.
once a year, maybe twice if you're lucky, a conversation happens that dictates your professional identity, your compensation, and, well, your entire trajectory at the company.
Yeah.
So, welcome to our deep dive. Our mission today is mastering this high-stakes performance review conversation.
Yes. And we are looking at this through a very specific lens today, focusing on a unique challenge that really doesn't get talked about enough.
Right, which is the acute challenge faced by non-native English speakers.
Totally. Because if you are managing this high stakes professional communication in a second or third language, the primary errors that trip you up aren't grammatical.
No, absolutely not. No one is denying you a promotion because you misused a preposition.
Exactly. Or like conjugated a verb poorly. The errors that actually hurt your career are tone errors.
Yeah.
It is this incredibly difficult tightrope walk. On one hand, you risk being way too passive when you desperately need to advocate for yourself. But on the other hand, you risk sounding, too blunt or aggressive when you need to give feedback.
That's so true.
It is entirely about nuance, missing the specific phrases that signal self-awareness, ambition, and collaborative thinking that can leave your manager with the completely wrong impression of your capabilities. And this happens independently of your actual work output.
Wow. So your actual work could be stellar, but the linguistic packaging just completely fails it.
It's
Okay, let's unpack this. We have a really clear roadmap today, and we're going to seamlessly walk through the entire life cycle of this crucial conversation. And the natural starting point, the way almost every performance review on the planet kicks off, is the self-evaluation.
right. And the self-evaluation is where so many people severely undersell themselves. And looking at the data, this is especially true for those navigating cultural differences alongside a second language.
Oh, the undersell. It drives me crazy. I've seen it so many times. It's like watching a movie trailer that shows absolutely no actual footage of the movie.
Yeah.
It just has plain text on a black screen saying, "It's a pretty good movie. We tried hard." That doesn't convince anyone to buy a ticket. Why do we do this?
Well, it generally comes down to modesty or deeply ingrained cultural conventions that heavily discourage boasting. So the default undersell sounds something like this. I think I did okay this year. I tried to contribute where I could.
I hear that, but let me push back for a second. In a lot of cultures, especially in parts of East Asia or Northern Europe, saying, "I crushed it this year and deserve more money," is going to sound painfully arrogant, even if it's completely factual.
Oh, absolutely.
So if you are operating in a global company, doesn't aggressive self-advocacy risk alienating a manager from a more modest background?
This raises a really important question, and it's exactly why we need to separate boasting from professional self-advocacy. The guiding principle here is that specificity is credibility.
Specificity is credibility. I like that.
Yeah, because vague self-praise, just saying, I'm amazing, that sounds hollow, subjective, and arrogant. But specific achievements with measurable outcomes, those sound earned and objective. You aren't bragging, you are simply reporting the facts of your impact.
So what does the professional self-advocate actually sound like in practice? Give me an example.
Sure, they use specific data-backed formulas. For example, this year I achieved X measurable outcome. I also took on this additional responsibility, which resulted in Y outcome. I'm proud of this specific contribution, and I believe it demonstrates my readiness for the next level.
Hmm. Notice how that doesn't trigger the arrogance alarm at all. It just sounds completely factual.
It really does. Other essential phrases to integrate here are things like, I'm particularly proud of, or I believe my strongest contribution this year was. You can also use one area where I've grown significantly is, and I feel I've demonstrated this quality through this specific example.
So like, I feel I've demonstrated leadership through the Q2 product launch.
Yeah.
It connects the abstract quality directly to the concrete evidence.
Yes. And structurally, you're actually doing the analytical work for your manager. You are presenting your value in a neatly packaged way that they can directly copy and paste into their own justification reports for upper management.
Here's where it gets really interesting, though.
Uh-huh.
Because after you list all your glowing achievements, the pendulum always swings.
Always.
The focus shifts to how you handle the manager's perspective, and inevitably that includes the critiques. When you're suddenly in the hot seat, how do you avoid the biological trap of getting defensive?
It is incredibly difficult. But you must remember a core tenet.
Ah.
Your reaction to the critical feedback is being evaluated just as carefully as the feedback itself.
Oh, wow. So they're watching how you take it.
Exactly. Defensiveness, deflection, or just shutting down and sitting there in complete silence, all of those create immediate, lasting negative impressions.
Right, because the fight or flight response just kicks in. The manager says a project didn't go well, and the immediate knee-jerk defensive response is like, I don't think that's fair because, or that wasn't really my fault. The marketing team gave us the assets a week late.
And the moment you say that, the manager completely stops hearing your logic and only hears resistance. The professional response, the one that disarms the tension in the room instantly, is this. Thank you for that feedback. I appreciate you being direct. Could you give me a specific example so I can better understand what to focus on?
Oh, that phrasing is so good. Thank you for being direct. It completely flips the dynamic from an attack to a collaboration.
Totally.
But let me ask the elephant in the room question. What if the manager is actually wrong? What if the criticism is genuinely, objectively unfair? Do you just swallow it to look professional?
Well, what's fascinating here is how you can handle genuine disagreement without crossing into insubordination. There is an exact phrasing for professional disagreement that protects your reputation. You say, I hear that and I want to make sure I understand it fully. My experience of that situation was X. I may have communicated it differently than I intended. What would the ideal outcome have looked like from your perspective?
My experience of that situation was that is such a powerful de-escalating phrase.
It works beautifully because of the psychology behind it. It neither accepts unfair criticism unconditionally, which would harm your reputation, nor does it reject it defensively, which harms your relationship.
Right. It opens a dialogue while signaling extremely high-level emotional intelligence. Okay, so we've survived receiving the critique. But modern performance reviews usually involve a 360-degree element.
Yes, they do.
That means transitioning from receiving feedback to giving it maybe to a peer, or maybe you're a manager evaluating your own team. And doing this in a second language is a complete minefield of potential tone errors. You can sound like a total jerk without meaning to.
It absolutely is a minefield. To give feedback that is brutally honest without being brutally harsh, you really need to rely on the SBI model. That stands for Situation, Behavior, Impact.
Situation, behavior, impact. Give me a really basic ELI 5, to explain, like I'm 5 example before we get into the corporate jargon.
Okay, imagine a roommate who never does the dishes. Instead of saying, you're incredibly lazy, which is a direct attack on their character.
Oh.
The SBI model sounds like this. When we agreed to split chores, that's the situation. And you left dishes in the sink for 3 days, that's the behavior. It meant I had to clean them before I could cook my own dinner. That's the impact.
Ah, I see. It completely removes the character assassination.
Yeah.
You aren't judging their soul, you're just pointing out a timeline of events. Now, how does that actually sound in a high-stakes corporate review?
A constructive corporate example would be, in the Q3 client presentation, when the data wasn't finalized until the morning of the meeting, it meant the team had to prepare responses on the spot, which affected our confidence in front of the client.
Wow. It just removes all the emotions, just cause and effect. Does this framework work for positive feedback too?
Beautifully. Because positive feedback needs to be specific to be meaningful. Otherwise, it just sounds like flattery. You could say, one thing I want to specifically call out is how you handled X. The way you did this behavior had a real impact on this outcome. It set a standard for the team.
Now, I know there are phrases we can use to sort of soften the blow when giving constructive feedback. Things like, something I'd love to see more of. Or one area where there's room to grow.
Yeah, exactly. Or I think the opportunity here is...
And what would really elevate this is, but I have to challenge this for a second, if we use all these corporate softening phrases, don't we risk diluting the feedback so much that the person totally misses the point and just thinks they're doing a great job?
That is a very common fear, but this is exactly where the SBI model saves you. The softening phrase is merely the delivery mechanism. The SBI model is the actual payload.
Mm-hmm. I like that.
If you use a softening phrase but immediately follow it up with a highly specific situation, behavior, and impact, it is impossible for the feedback to be diluted. The specificity prevents the dilution, while the softening phrase prevents the defensiveness.
That makes perfect sense. The softness is in the tone, but the hard clarity is in the details. Now, successfully giving feedback naturally leads to looking inward at your own areas for development. And we all know the classic terrible interview maneuver here.
Disguising a strength as a weakness?
Yes. My biggest weakness is I just work too hard, or I care too much about perfection.
Hmm.
It makes me cringe just thinking about it. Why do managers hate that so much?
Because it's intellectually dishonest, and it's a massive trap. Deflecting by saying, I can't think of anything, or overselling a strength, immediately tells the manager that you severely lack self-awareness. The professional development conversation requires a very specific approach.
Give us the exact phrasing to use instead.
You should say, one area I'm actively working on is this genuine area. I've recognized this specific impact, and I've started the specific action I'm taking. I'd welcome your support or suggestions on how to develop this further.
I love how proactive that is. I've started.
Right. If we connect this to the bigger picture, this response signals three crucial things simultaneously. Self-awareness, because you actually know your flaws. Agency, because you aren't waiting for permission, you are already taking steps to fix them. And openness to support, because you are actively inviting the manager to mentor you.
Those are powerful signals.
All three are exactly what leadership looks for in top-tier performers.
So what does this all mean? If you've nailed the self-evaluation, handled the critical feedback beautifully, offered great peer feedback using SBI, and showed deep self-awareness, how do you bridge the gap between being a great employee and actually asking for the next title? Because you can't just sit there silently hoping the manager brings it up out of the goodness of their heart.
You absolutely cannot wait. The performance review is the natural, culturally expected moment to discuss career progression. Vague deferrals are career stalls. If you don't bring it up, the default corporate assumption is that you are perfectly content where you are.
So how do we push that door open without sounding, I don't know, entitled?
You open the promotion conversation with a collaborative inquiry rather than a demand. You say, I'd like to take a few minutes to discuss my career path, specifically what the path to the next role looks like from your perspective.
From your perspective, that invites them into the planning process rather than backing them into a corner.
Exactly.
But eventually, you have to actually make the hard case for yourself.
And you do that by explicitly connecting your past performance to future expectations. You state, based on my contributions this year, particularly this specific achievement, I feel I've been operating at a level above my current role. I'd like to understand what criteria would need to be met for a title change and whether the timeline we're working toward is this time frame.
That is incredibly direct. I feel I've been operating at a level above my current role.
It is direct, but because it is anchored to the specific, measurable achievements you discussed at the very beginning of the meeting, it is evidence-based, not ego-based.
But what happens if the manager says, listen, you're doing great, but budgets are tight? The answer right now is not yet.
You must always convert a not yet into a specific target. You do not just accept the vague rejection. Reply, I appreciate that. Could you help me understand what specifically I'd need to demonstrate and over what time frame? I want to make sure I'm working toward a clear target.
Wow. You're forcing the vague rejection to become a concrete development plan. Now, I want to bring all these communication strategies to life because when you see them in action, it's like watching a masterclass.
Oh, definitely.
Let me tell you about Elena. Historically, Elena's performance reviews had always gone fine. Her manager would sit down and say, good work this year, keep it up. And Elena, navigating this nuanced conversation in her second language, would just smile, nod, say thank you, and leave the room.
A very common passive survival strategy.
Right. But this time, she completely changed the playbook. She didn't do the undersell. She opened with her specific achievements, backed up with hard revenue numbers. When the manager brought up two challenging projects that had some hiccups, instead of getting defensive and blaming the timeline, she listened. She literally used the phrase, could you give me a specific example? I want to make sure I understand what to focus on.
She neutralized the tension in the room and actively sought clarity. Brilliant.
And then, near the end, she looked at him and said, I'd like to take a few minutes to discuss my career path. Her manager was visibly surprised. He actually physically leaned forward. Because suddenly, Elena wasn't just a passive worker bin nodding along. She was a strategic partner in her own career.
And before she left that room, she likely used the crucial final check.
She did. As the main review wound down and the tension dropped, she asked one final thing before leaving. She asked, is there anything we haven't covered today that you think would be useful for me to be aware of?
That single question signals a maturity and openness that very few employees demonstrate. It gives the manager explicit permission to share those subtle, informal observations they might have been holding back.
I always feel like that question is almost dangerous, like you're actively inviting more critique just when you survive the meeting.
It requires immense confidence, yes, but it invites honest information rather than just seeking validation. It ensures there are zero blind spots when you leave that room.
Well, for Elena, it ended up being the best performance review either of them had ever had.
That's amazing.
Once she established her value and positioned herself as a strategic partner, she naturally opened the door for the next logical step, making sure she was actually compensated for that new baseline. How do we pivot to the money without killing the collaborative vibe we just spent an hour building?
The golden rule from negotiation experts is that discussing salary should be kept very brief during the actual review. The performance review is merely the opener, the justification stage. It is not the full, hard negotiation.
So what's the exact phrase to plant the seed?
You simply state, I'd also like to discuss compensation. Based on my contributions this year and market data I've reviewed, I'm hoping we can discuss an adjustment that reflects the value I've been adding.
Short, sweet, and anchored to value. And then you follow up separately for the actual negotiation. Speaking of following up, there's a fascinating mechanism we need to cover. The 24-hour follow-up email.
Oh, yes. Sending a precise follow-up email within 24 hours shows exceptional professional discipline.
But why does it matter so much mechanically? Isn't it just about being polite?
It's not just about being polite. Mechanically, you are creating an undeniable HR paper trail. By putting your goals into writing, you are locking that narrative into the corporate record.
Right, right.
If your manager leaves the company tomorrow or there's a reorg, your progress doesn't disappear with them. The template should read, "Thank you for the conversation today. I found it genuinely useful. I've noted the key areas we discussed, and I'm committed to this specific action on my development area. I'll follow up in this time frame on the specific next step we agreed on."
It puts it all in writing. It locks in the manager's commitments just as much as your own. Okay, we have covered a massive amount of ground today. To solidify everything we've discussed, let's group these language tools into a definitive, rapid-fire phrase bank. Instead of just listing them, let's group them by the vibe you need to project. Are you ready?
Let's do it. Let's build the toolkit.
Okay, first up, the self-advocate vibe. When you need to own your wins without sounding arrogant.
You use phrases like, "My strongest contribution this year was," or "I took on additional responsibility in X and delivered Y, and I'm proud of this achievement and believe it demonstrates this quality."
Perfect. Next vibe, the peacemaker. When you are receiving critical feedback and need to deflect defensiveness.
You pivot to curiosity. Could you give me a specific example? Or, "My experience of that situation was X. What would the ideal outcome have looked like? And I want to make sure I'm understanding this correctly."
Excellent. Now the mentor vibe. When giving feedback using the SBI model.
Stick to the facts. In this situation, when you did this behavior, the impact was this outcome. And to soften the delivery, one thing I'd love to see more of, or what would really elevate this is...
Next, the self-awareness vibe. When forced to discuss your own development areas.
Frame it professionally with, "One area I'm actively working on is, and I've started this specific action and I'd welcome your support."
The ambitious vibe. To spark the promotion conversation without waiting for permission.
"I'd like to discuss my career path, specifically what the path to this role looks like. And if they push back, convert it to a target. What specifically would I need to demonstrate and over what time frame?"
And finally, the no blind spots closing vibe.
Is there anything we haven't covered that would be useful for me to know?
That phrase bank right there is pure gold. It covers every possible scenario. And to show you how actively this exact language alters a career trajectory, I have to share one more story. Marcos.
Marcos's story is a perfect example of language bridging the painful gap between deep effort and actual recognition.
Exactly. Marcos had been in his role for 2 years. He had the same title, same salary, but the reality was his day-to-day work had gotten significantly harder. The scope of his duties had gotten much wider, but the recognition just hadn't followed.
That is a very frustrating but incredibly common corporate plateau.
So this year, he decided to completely change his approach. He didn't just walk in hoping his manager would magically notice his late nights. He walked in with specific numbers. He brought up the 3 major projects he'd led. He listed the exact revenue outcome of each one. He named the junior team members he'd mentored, and he explicitly outlined the internal process he'd improved.
He built an undeniable evidence-based case for his own value.
And here's the turning point. When his manager gave the standard vague wrap-up, "Overall, Marcos, it's been a good year," Marcos didn't just nod and leave. He unapologetically interjected and said, "I'd like to share some specifics if that's okay."
He sees control of the narrative right there.
He laid out his case beautifully, using the exact formulas we discussed. And then he explicitly stated, "I feel I've been operating at a level above my current role. I'd like to understand what the path to senior looks like and what I'd need to demonstrate."
And because he used that highly specific professional phrasing, his manager didn't perceive it as an aggressive demand. It simply sounded like a logical conclusion based on the overwhelming evidence he had just presented.
Exactly. His manager actually nodded slowly and said, "You know what? You're right. Let's talk about that." 6 months later, the promotion to senior actually happened. Here's the craziest part to me. The hard work had been there for 2 entire years. Marcos hadn't suddenly become a better employee in those last 6 months. It just took the right language to finally make his existing value visible.
Which brings us to the core realization of this entire deep dive. A performance review is not an event that just happens to you, like the weather. It is a highly dynamic conversation, and it is one that you can actively shape, direct, and control, provided you have the right preparation and the right linguistic tools. You always have agency here.
I want to leave you with one final provocative thought to mull over. We've spent this time dissecting how mastering this specific language makes your invisible work incredibly visible during a once-a-year, high-stakes review. But think about this. How might deliberately practicing this exact phrasing in your regular weekly one-on-ones or your daily casual interactions completely reshape your manager's baseline perception of you before the annual review even begins? Imagine walking into that room already knowing you're viewed as a strategic leader, just because of how you've been talking for the past 12 months. Be sure to subscribe to Fluent Daily so you don't miss a thing. Our next deep dive is going to be huge. We are covering the English you need for high-stakes presentations. We'll be breaking down the magnetic openers, the seamless transitions, how to handle aggressive questions from the audience, and the specific phrases that make you sound completely in command from the first word to the very last.
See you there.
See you there.